Right now, somewhere in your house, a dog is waiting by the door, ears up, tail moving, watching for you, and only you. You've seen this 1,000 times. You probably don't think about it at all. Maybe it happens when your car pulls into the driveway. Maybe it happens the second you pick up your keys. But the real answer to why that's happening is far stranger than man's best friend. It has nothing to do with humans choosing a companion. It has everything to do with a gray wolf. Tens of thousands of years ago, making a calculation, a cold, hungry, brutally practical calculation. And it changed the future of two species forever. Here's the reframe you need to sit with. You were probably taught that humans domesticated wolves, that your ancestors found some wolf pups, raised them by the fire, and bred the friendliest ones together. It's a nice story. Warm, simple, easy to picture. It's also mostly wrong. The truth is closer to this. The wolves domesticated themselves. Humans just showed up as the opportunity. Your ancestors didn't design this relationship. They stumbled into it, the same way you stumble into most of the biggest turns in your own life. Why would a wild predator take that risk? What did it actually get in return? And what does that ancient bargain reveal about the choices playing out in your own relationships today? Start with the world your ancestors actually lived in. Somewhere between 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, deep in the last ice age, cold, unforgiving, food was never guaranteed. Humans lived in small hunting bands, moving with the seasons, following herds across frozen ground. Gray wolves lived in packs nearby, hunting the exact same herds. Deer, bison, wild horses, same prey, same freezing landscape, same constant hunger. You'd expect conflict between two apex predators competing for the same food, and there was some. Wolves and humans almost certainly killed each other more than once. But something quieter was happening at the edges of every human camp, something that mattered far more in the long run. Leftovers, bones, scraps, waste that humans didn't want, and wolves desperately needed. A biologist named Raymond Coppinger spent decades studying exactly this question, and he proposed what's now called the dump-dwelling hypothesis. In plain English, that means some wolves began surviving by scavenging near human camps instead of hunting large prey on their own. Think about what that actually required from a wild animal. A wolf that could get close to a human camp without triggering full panic, a wolf that could tolerate smoke, noise, unfamiliar smells, and unfamiliar creatures walking upright on two legs carrying spears. Most wolves simply couldn't do it. Their stress response was too intense. They'd bolt long before they got close enough to eat. But a small number of wolves had a different temperament from birth, calmer, less reactive, willing to sit at a distance, watch, and wait instead of running. And here's the part that matters most in this entire story. Those calmer wolves ate more consistently. They wasted less energy sprinting away from every perceived threat, and they survived brutal Ice Age winters that quietly killed off their more anxious, more aggressive relatives. Nature was running a selection experiment without anyone designing it. Not on strength, not on speed, not even on intelligence, on tolerance. So who was actually being domesticated here? Because it wasn't wolves being tamed by kind humans around a fire. It was wolves quietly selecting themselves, generation after generation, for one narrow trait, the ability to stay calm around the most dangerous animal on the landscape. This idea sounds almost too tidy, too convenient to be real biology. So scientists tested it directly. Not on wolves, since that experiment would take centuries, but on a close relative. In one of the most famous studies in modern genetics, in 1959, a Soviet geneticist named Dmitri Belyaev began breeding silver foxes on a research farm in Siberia. His method was simple and almost ruthless in its precision every single generation. He selected only the calmest foxes to breed together. The ones that didn't flinch, the ones that didn't snap or panic when a human approached the cage. He wasn't selecting for size. He wasn't selecting for fur color or speed or intelligence. Only for one variable, tameness around people. Within a few generations, something nobody predicted began to happen. The foxes didn't just start acting friendlier. They started looking physically different. Floppy ears instead of the sharp upright ears of a wild fox. Curled, wagging tail. Patches of white fur appearing on otherwise uniform coats. Shorter, rounder snouts. Nobody bred for any of that. It arrived on its own. Scientists now call this cluster of changes domestication syndrome. In plain English, it means that when animals are bred purely for calmness toward humans, an entire package of physical traits tends to appear alongside it because tameness and certain physical features are controlled by overlapping biological pathways inside a developing embryo. Belyaev never got to run this exact experiment on wolves. He didn't have thousands of years, but the pattern lines up almost perfectly with what happened to the wolf populations that eventually became dogs: floppy ears, curled tails, rounder faces, shorter muzzles in many breeds. None of that helps a wild wolf hunt or survive a harsh winter or defend territory. All of it shows up naturally once selection shifts from who can kill efficiently to who can tolerate people without panicking. Does that change the picture in your head of the first moment dogs and humans connected? Was it ever really a choice your ancestors sat down and made, or was it a door that a small number of unusually calm wolves quietly walked through on their own? One cautious step at a time. The genetics behind this story back it up in an even more direct way. A researcher at UCLA named Robert Wayne has spent years analyzing wolf and dog DNA, tracing the exact branching point where domestic dogs split away from wild gray wolves. His work, combined with later studies using ancient DNA pulled from fossilized bones, points to dogs separating from wolf populations somewhere between 20 and 40,000 years ago. That's earlier than almost any other domesticated animal on Earth. Earlier than cattle, earlier than sheep. Earlier than agriculture itself, by a wide margin. That detail matters more than it might seem. At first, humans hadn't settled down yet when this began. There were no farms, no permanent villages, no stored grain worth guarding. No livestock pens to defend. Dogs became partners to humans while your ancestors were still nomadic hunters, sleeping in temporary camps, never fully certain where the next meal would come from. Which raises an obvious question. What exactly did humans get out of this arrangement? More than you might assume. A calmer wolf lingering near camp acted like an early warning system, alert to approaching predators or rival human groups long before any person would notice. Its sense of smell, dramatically sharper than any humans, could track wounded prey across long distances of frozen, featureless terrain. Over time, some of these wolves likely joined hunts directly, driving prey toward waiting hunters with spears. Both species were, in a very real sense, running a joint survival strategy long before either one understood what was happening. Neither side signed up for a partnership. It simply became more efficient than working alone. The physical evidence backs this up too. Buried in the ground for tens of thousands of years before anyone dug it up. In 1914, workers in Germany uncovered a set of bones near a site called Bonn-Ober Castle. Buried alongside two human skeletons was the skeleton of a small canine, dated to roughly 14,000 years ago. Later analysis of its teeth showed something remarkable. The animal had survived a serious illness as a puppy, an illness that would have killed it within days without care. Someone fed it, someone kept it warm, someone let it live for weeks while it was too sick to hunt or forage on its own. That's not the behavior of two species locked in cold. Transactional coexistence. That's the earliest physical proof historians have, that the bond had already turned into something closer to family, at least 14,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. Similar burials keep turning up. At a site called Predmosty, in what's now the Czech Republic, archaeologists found canine skulls deliberately placed with objects in their mouths, buried with the same care given to human dead. Whatever these animals were to the people who buried them, they weren't simply tools anymore, and they weren't simply scavengers tolerated at the edge of camp. So somewhere between the cold calculation of this dump-dwelling hypothesis and a sick puppy being nursed back to health by hunter-gatherers, something shifted. Utility turned into attachment. And once that shift happened, there was no turning back for either species. Now, here comes the counterintuitive twist, and it's the part most retellings of this story quietly skip over. It's easy to imagine all of this as warm cooperative, a bond built gradually out of mutual affection, but the biology underneath it was cold, indifferent, and driven entirely by survival math, not by anything resembling love. The wolves that approached human camps weren't being brave in any noble sense of the word. They were simply the individuals with a slightly different stress hormone response, a nervous system that didn't spike as hard when something unfamiliar entered its space. That's the entire mechanism. A biological quirk in a handful of individuals, not a decision, not an act of trust, and your ancestors weren't selecting a companion out of warmth. either. Early humans almost certainly tolerated these wolves for the same reason they tolerated anything difficult, because it was useful or, at minimum, not dangerous enough to be worth fighting over. Genuine attachment, the kind you feel toward a dog today, likely came centuries later, layered on top of a relationship that started as pure utility. So the animal curled up on your couch right now exists because of a cold, indifferent ice age filtering process that had absolutely nothing to do with sentiment. Does that make the bond feel less real to you, or does it make it more remarkable that something built entirely on survival math eventually turned into something this deep? Here's where the story gets even stranger, and this is where a modern researcher named Brian Hare enters the picture. Hare, a cognitive scientist, ran a series of experiments comparing dogs, wolves, and even chimpanzees, humans' closest living relatives on the entire planet. The test was simple. A researcher would point directly at a container hiding food and watch what each animal did with that information. Chimpanzees, despite being far more intelligent by almost every conventional measure, mostly ignored the pointing gesture entirely. Wolves raised from puppyhood by human caretakers also struggled to understand it, but dogs, including dogs with no formal training whatsoever, understood the gesture almost instantly. They followed the human finger like it was the most obvious signal in the world. In plain English, this means dogs evolved a very specific ability to read human gestures, almost like a second language wired directly into their instincts before birth. This wasn't intelligence in some broad general sense. It was a narrow, highly specific form of social intelligence, aimed entirely at understanding one particular species. Yours, that kind of ability doesn't develop in a single lifetime of living near a campfire. That's something carved slowly into an entire species across thousands of generations through the same self-selecting filter that started with a handful of unusually calm wolves near a Paleolithic fire circle. Which means the dog lying beside you right now isn't simply a tamed wolf. It's the accumulated result of tens of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure aimed at one target, understanding you specifically better than any other animal on Earth can. Now bring this forward into the present, because the mirror here sits closer than it first appears. In 2015, a Japanese researcher named Miho Nagasawa published a study showing that when dogs and their owners gazed into each other's eyes, both species released oxytocin, a hormone linked to bonding, trust, and attachment, the same chemical released between a parent and a newborn infant. That means the simple act of eye contact between you and a dog triggers a biochemical loop, usually reserved for the closest relationships humans form. Not friendship in the casual sense. Not loyalty as an abstract idea. A literal chemical bond running in both directions at once, measurable in blood tests on both species. Sit with what that actually means. An animal descended from an Ice Age predator now shares a neurochemical bonding system with you that mirrors the one between a parent and a child. That's not some quirk of modern pet culture invented by marketing or convenience. That's the finish line of a process that began with cold survival math tens of thousands of years before either species had any concept of affection. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with the longest, because the same underlying pattern shows up in you, in places that have nothing to do with dogs at all. Think about the people you trust most in your own life. They probably aren't the loudest people you know. They're probably not the most aggressive, or the most dominant, or the ones who need to win every conversation. They're usually the calm ones. The ones who don't spike into panic or anger the moment something becomes uncertain or difficult. The ones who simply feel safe to be near without you having to think about why. That's not a coincidence. Calm in humans, just as much as in wolves, has always functioned as a survival signal, not merely a personality trait. It tells everyone nearby that it's safe to approach. It always has, going back far longer than either species has existed in its current form. Think about the last time you walked into a stressful room, a tense meeting, a crowded emergency waiting area, a family conflict that hadn't been resolved yet. Your nervous system was scanning for exactly one thing before anything else. Who in this room is regulated? Who isn't going to make this worse? You weren't looking for the smartest person in the room or the most powerful one. You were looking for the calm one, the same way a hungry, frightened wolf once scanned a human camp for a threat level low enough to risk approaching. That instinct is old, older than agriculture. Older than language, most likely. It's the same circuitry that let a handful of wolves decide a fire was worth the risk, running quietly underneath every decision you make about who to trust, who to let close, and who to keep at a distance. So what do you actually feel the next time a dog waits calmly by your door, watching for you and only you? Because right now, somewhere in your house, a dog is waiting by the door, ears up, tail moving, watching for you and only you, except now you know what you're actually looking at. Not a tamed animal, not a pet. In the small, casual sense of that word, a living result of an Ice Age bargain struck by a handful of unusually calm wolves who chose to sit near your ancestors' fire instead of running from it, and simply never left.